Stop ignoring joint pain. I know it's tempting to write off that morning stiffness as just getting older. Maybe you've been doing that for years, telling yourself it's normal, popping an over the counter pill when it gets bad, and moving on with your day. But here's what I want you to understand: that stiffness isn't just a symptom to manage. It's a signal from something happening deep inside your joints, and there's a specific daily habit that works directly on the actual mechanism causing it, not just the pain on the surface. Let's talk about your synovial fluid and the cartilage it's supposed to be protecting. Every movable joint in your body, your knees, hips, shoulders, fingers, is cushioned by a layer of cartilage and lubricated by a thick gel-like substance called synovial fluid. Think of cartilage as the cushioning between two bones, and synovial fluid as the oil that keeps everything moving smoothly, reducing friction with every step, every grip, every movement you make throughout the day. Here's what happens as we age, and especially with inactivity. Cartilage naturally has very limited blood supply of its own. It depends almost entirely on movement, specifically the compression and release of the joint during activity, to circulate that synovial fluid and deliver nutrients to the cartilage cells. When a joint moves less, that fluid circulates less, cartilage cells receive less nourishment, and the fluid itself gradually becomes thicker and less effective as a lubricant. Here's what this feels like in real life: stiffness first thing in the morning that takes a while to work itself out. A joint that feels fine once you get moving but aches again after sitting for a long stretch. A gradual decline in how far you can comfortably bend or reach compared to a few years ago. Sound familiar? Most people respond to this with anti-inflammatory medication, and to be clear, that has its place for acute flare-ups. But relying on it as your only strategy doesn't address why the joint is becoming stiffer and less nourished in the first place. Medication can quiet the inflammatory signal temporarily, but it doesn't restore circulation to the cartilage or improve the quality of your synovial fluid. Okay, here's the good news. There's a specific daily habit, one that takes just a few minutes, that directly targets synovial fluid circulation and cartilage nourishment at the mechanical level. Ready? Let's get into it. The key concept here is something called the synovial pump mechanism. Here's the analogy I like to use. Think of cartilage like a sponge sitting in a shallow puddle of fluid. If that sponge just sits there, motionless, it slowly dries out and the surrounding fluid stagnates. But if you gently compress and release that sponge repeatedly, fluid gets pulled in and pushed back out with each squeeze, keeping the sponge saturated and the surrounding fluid moving and fresh. Your joint cartilage works almost exactly the same way. Here's the mechanism, step by step. When you move a joint through its full range of motion, the cartilage surfaces compress slightly under load, squeezing out old, waste-laden fluid. When the joint releases, the cartilage rebounds, drawing in fresh, nutrient-rich synovial fluid. This repeated cycle, compress and release, is literally how your cartilage gets fed, since it lacks the direct blood vessel network that most other tissues in your body rely on. Here's why this matters so much as we age. A joint that only moves through a small portion of its available range, which happens naturally with a sedentary lifestyle, only pumps fluid through part of the cartilage surface. The rest of that cartilage, the parts that would only be reached at the far end of a full range of motion, ends up chronically undernourished, which accelerates the exact kind of wear and thinning associated with joint pain and stiffness over time. This is where the specific daily habit comes in, because deliberately moving your major joints through their complete range of motion, not just the partial range most daily activities require, directly maximizes this pumping mechanism. Here's exactly what the habit looks like. Once daily, ideally in the morning when stiffness tends to be at its worst, spend about 5 minutes moving through a full range of motion sequence for your major joints. This includes slow, controlled circles for your shoulders and hips, full bends and straightening for your knees, gentle wrist and ankle rotations, and a slow spinal twist and forward fold for your back. The key detail is moving slowly and deliberately through the entire available range, not rushing through a partial movement. Research on joint mobility exercises has shown that consistent full range of motion movement is associated with improved synovial fluid viscosity and reduced stiffness, particularly in people with early stage joint changes related to age or inactivity. My tip: do this before you've had coffee or checked your phone, literally right after you sit up in bed, since this is exactly when your joints are stiffest, and it takes just a few minutes before you move on with your morning routine. Now, let's talk about the anti inflammatory piece, because movement alone isn't the whole picture, and a specific compound works alongside this mechanical habit rather well. The compound here is curcumin, found in turmeric. Here's what it does: curcumin has been shown to inhibit specific inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines, particularly ones involved in cartilage breakdown and joint inflammation. It works at a molecular level that's genuinely comparable in some research to certain anti inflammatory medications, though obviously it's not a replacement for prescribed treatment when that's medically necessary. Here's the catch, and this is important: curcumin on its own is poorly absorbed by your digestive system. Most of it passes through without ever reaching your bloodstream in meaningful amounts. This is why turmeric alone, sprinkled on food, often disappoints people looking for joint relief specifically. Research has shown that combining curcumin with piperine, the active compound in black pepper, increases curcumin absorption dramatically, in some studies by as much as 2,000%, because piperine inhibits an enzyme in your gut and liver that would otherwise rapidly break curcumin down before it can be absorbed. The dose studied for joint-related benefits is typically around 500 milligrams of curcumin, combined with a small amount of piperine taken once or twice daily, ideally with a meal containing some fat, since curcumin is fat-soluble and absorbs better alongside dietary fat. Tip: if you're using turmeric in cooking rather than a supplement, always add a pinch of black pepper and cook it in oil or ghee, since this combination meaningfully improves how much curcumin your body actually absorbs compared to turmeric alone in water-based dishes. Now let's talk about omega-3 fatty acids, since they work through a genuinely different anti-inflammatory pathway than curcumin does. The active compounds are EPA and DHA, found concentrated in fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines. Here's the mechanism: omega-3s get incorporated into cell membranes throughout your body, including in the cells lining your joints, and they get converted into signaling molecules that actively resolve inflammation rather than simply blocking it. This is a genuinely different mechanism than most anti-inflammatory medications, which block inflammatory signals, whereas omega-3 derived compounds help actively wind the inflammatory process down. Research has shown that regular omega-3 intake is associated with reduced joint stiffness and pain in people with inflammatory joint conditions, with some studies showing meaningful symptom improvement over several months of consistent intake. The dose studied is typically around 2 to 3 grams combined EPA and DHA daily, which is roughly equivalent to 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish weekly, or a fish oil supplement if dietary intake isn't practical. Tip: if you choose a supplement, look specifically for the EPA and DHA amounts listed on the label, not just total fish oil content, since some products are diluted enough that the actual active compound amount is quite low despite a large total serving size. Now, if you're finding this helpful, this is exactly the kind of thing I like breaking down on this channel, taking apart the real mechanisms behind common aches and pains, not just generic advice to take an ibuprofen and move on. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. Let's talk about hydration too, since it directly affects synovial fluid consistency. Synovial fluid is largely water-based, and mild chronic dehydration can make it thicker and less effective as a lubricant, similar to how motor oil that's too thick doesn't flow as smoothly through an engine. Aiming for consistent hydration throughout the day, roughly half your body weight in ounces as a general starting guideline, supports better synovial fluid consistency alongside the movement habit we discussed. Let's talk about weight-bearing considerations too, since this comes up often in questions about joint health. Excess body weight increases the mechanical load on weight-bearing joints, particularly knees and hips, with every single step. Research has shown that even modest weight loss in people who are carrying excess weight produces a meaningfully larger reduction in joint load than the percentage of weight lost alone would suggest, because the mechanical forces on your knees during walking are actually several times your body weight with each step. Let's talk timeline, because I want to be honest here. The morning mobility habit often produces a noticeable reduction in morning stiffness within just 1 to 2 weeks of consistent practice, since it's working directly on fluid circulation that responds relatively quickly to consistent movement. The curcumin and omega-3 approach tends to take longer to show meaningful effect, typically 4 to 8 weeks of consistent daily intake, since it's working at a slower cellular inflammatory level rather than a mechanical one. This isn't a replacement for medical evaluation if you're experiencing significant joint pain, swelling, or any sudden change in joint function. These approaches work well alongside medical guidance for diagnosed joint conditions like osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, not instead of appropriate medical care. Let me answer a few common questions. First, will this help with more advanced arthritis or just early stiffness? The mobility habit and anti-inflammatory nutrients can provide meaningful symptom relief across a range of severity, but more advanced joint damage, particularly significant cartilage loss, isn't something these approaches can fully reverse. They're most effective as a foundational daily practice, whether used on their own for early stiffness or alongside medical treatment for more established conditions. Second, is it safe to do the mobility routine if a joint is actively painful that day? Gentle, pain-free range of motion is generally considered safe and often helpful, even on days when a joint feels stiff or mildly achy. However, if you're experiencing sharp pain, significant swelling, or a joint that feels unstable, that's a signal to check with a doctor before continuing any exercise routine rather than pushing through it. Third, can I take curcumin and omega-3 supplements together? Generally, yes, they work through different mechanisms and are commonly used together in research and in practice. As always, check with your doctor first, particularly if you're on blood thinning medication, since both curcumin and omega-3s can have mild blood thinning effects at higher doses. So here's the bigger picture I want you to walk away with. This was never just about popping a pill when a joint acts up. It's about a mechanical and biochemical system, synovial fluid circulation, cartilage nourishment, and inflammatory signaling that determines whether your joints stay well lubricated and resilient or gradually stiffen and wear down over time. The daily mobility habit, curcumin with black pepper, omega-3s from fatty fish, and consistent hydration all work on different pieces of that same underlying system. Combine these consistently, and you're giving your joints the actual conditions they need to stay nourished and mobile, rather than simply managing pain after it's already flared up. If you want to go deeper, my next video breaks down the specific stretches and strengthening exercises that protect your knees and hips as you age, and why strength, not just flexibility, matters just as much for joint health. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I'll see you in the next one.